If they're accused of being racist, then many forces would take the view you're not suitable to be a police officer. I don't think your had mate was one comment. I think the officer was almost like contradicting what Henry was telling him. You have to assess whether you need to use force at that time on that individual in those circumstances. That's where policing has almost gone the wrong way around in the last 15, 20 years. I don't think it's a failure in medical training. I think from what they were told, which the trial judge acknowledged was almost like a whole fabrication, a series of lies from a number of people, including the eventual suspect, the murderer, and his family. I don't think your had mate was one comment, which I think was poorly judged and poorly worded. I think the officer was almost like contradicting what Henry was telling him. The fact they hadn't then checked him, I think, just shows what a difficult and challenging situation it was in darkness and in a very confined space as well. My understanding was he was basically by a wall, and to actually get to him to treat him, that to literally drag him out from the wall because he was unable to stand. So I don't think there's a failure in medical training. The police officers are trained to the extent they need to be. Clearly, the medical training, the enhanced medical training and advanced medical training comes from paramedics, ambulance services, etc. That's their expertise, professionalism. Police officers have the required training that they are given to try and save life initially, but we try and hand it over to a professional and trained paramedic. The handcuffing issue, I think, is part of the investigation by an OPC, and rightly so. For me, there's different stages here. The fact they had an allegation given to them that was then corroborated, in essence, and supported by witnesses at the time and the initial call. As soon as you've got someone who suspects, and suspects is a word, not believe, suspects has committed a criminal offence, legislation requires you to tell that person they're under arrest and to, it's being called read them their rights, but you caution them that anything they say from that point on can be used in evidence, potentially used in evidence against them. So I think the arrest is one aspect of it. If it's then led them to actually handcuff him, for me, handcuffing is a separate issue. It's a use of force. And you have to assess whether you need to use force at that time on that individual in those circumstances. And that's up to the officers to justify why they decided they needed to handcuff him at that point in time. The fact they've arrested him shouldn't automatically lead to handcuffing. And that's where the decision-making process comes into it for the officers on scene, based on everything around them, not just what we've seen on the body-worn video, but everything they knew, had been told and could see and hear at the time. So handcuffing for me is a separate issue for the officers. The arrest and caution, I think, is based on what they were told at the time, as in an offence has been alleged. There is what sees prima facie evidence of that offence being committed and a suspect in front of you. So you are legally bound to tell that person, you are now suspect for an assault, an offence, and I need to caution you that anything you say from here on in could potentially be used against you. You can always then de-arrest somebody if once you investigate it, once things slow down, that actually the offence that you thought you had initially didn't take place. So you can de-arrest them later. It never reached that stage, sadly, with Henry, because events overtook them in respect of his condition. So handcuffing for me is a separate issue. The 8 minutes, once they realised having handcuffed him, he was clearly in an exceptionally distressed state, had trouble breathing. You then move into almost like an assessment of their medical and physical condition, their fitness. That's when they realised, I think, that his medical condition had worsened far more. So your priority then comes down to saving life. And everything else tends to take a back seat, has to take a back seat then, because your priority then is keeping this person alive. So you then have to move them from the position that you found them in so you could actually get to them properly. So at that stage, and having done CPR on a couple of occasions, you don't then start checking for other injuries, because your focus is get them breathing and keep them breathing, keep them alive. And that's what your focus at the point is. It's not about looking for other injuries, because your focus is to make sure they are still breathing and hopefully then talking to you. It doesn't sound, having read some of the transcripts, they reached that stage by the time that the ambulance service turned up. So the 8 minutes for me is 8 minutes of trying to save life, trying to get them breathing, which when you're doing it seems an exceptionally long period of time, but in respect of your decision making and the steps you would normally take, it has to pause, because your priority has to be about preserving or saving life. And that for me was clearly, when you look at some of the words, the transcripts, what they were saying to each other, their focus then became about, we've now got a life to try and save here. everything else has to be paused and take a back seat. I think it's impacting their decision making. I think they are moving away from enforcing the law, implying the law, and actually understanding law and legislation, because there's been such a focus in policing on diversity, equality, inclusivity, etc. There's been such a focus on it, and a significant portion of the training is now about understanding diversity, understanding differences, how we deal with differences, how we approach them, how they almost like come after applying the law. And I think that that's where policing has almost gone the wrong way around in the last 15, 20 years. Essentially, your job as a police officer is to prevent crime, detect crime, investigate offences, just keep an open mind when you turn up at these incidents. You know what you've been told on the call, but that's almost come from one source. You wouldn't ordinarily take one source of information for everything you do in life. You would check things first and ask somebody else. That seems to me that in some cases, talking outside this particular case, but in many cases, police officers are concerned if they don't apply various principles around equality and diversity, then that's potentially career threatening, job ending, that they may be accused then of being racist. If they're accused of being racist, then many forces would take the view you're not suitable to be a police officer. So I think there is a genuine concern with police officers in modern times that actually their first priority for themselves, one is keeping the job, but to keep the job, they have to apply equality and diversity principles above and beyond just being a police officer and applying the law fairly, evenly, and in a balanced way. I think common sense and logic has to be applied. I think this is one individual. The actual ceremonial dagger he had isn't the one that most Sikhs carry, to my knowledge. I've taught Sikhs in a police training environment who had their kirpan on them. They actually pulled it out of their clothing and showed us all, much to the amusement of the rest of the students. So I've been in classrooms and in situations where they've shown me this ceremonial dagger, which is much smaller and shorter than the one this individual used to carry out this attack. Scottish ceremonial dress, so I think it's called a ski and do or something, allows a dagger to be carried in the sock. So there are other elements as well, other beliefs and followings where other instruments that you could potentially be called a weapon can be carried as well. So I think common sense and a bit of balance here, proportionality, needs to be applied. This was not the actual ceremonial dagger that many, but the majority of Sikhs carry. It was a different version of it. And I think the Sikh community have clarified and explained that many times. So I think that common sense, logic, and proportionality needs to be applied before we go banning every single piece of ceremonial possessions from being carried by anybody in any community. Yeah, that is a challenging one for policing. This common accusation of two tier, but I think two tiers being misinterpreted or misrepresented by many. That they view it as favouritism, where in effect there are different levels, different tiers, for want of a better term, then of how you deal with different people. People do need to be treated according to what their needs are. I would deal with an 85-year-old victim of a burglary differently to what I deal with a 25-year-old, and the same with an assault victim. 70, 80-year-old victim who's been assaulted, I would deal probably slightly differently than a 25-year-old lad who's been punched on the night out. So we've always dealt with people according to how they need to be dealt with and how they want to be dealt with. The fact that people are now trying to attribute it seems to me, to race as opposed to their personal individual needs is where it's been misinterpreted. So there are different tiers in how police approach people. There always has been. Throughout my service, we dealt with people slightly differently depending on who it was, where they were, what their needs were. The fact that people are trying to attribute this two-tier policing to a favouritism based on somebody's skin colour or race, I think it's been deliberately misjudged, deliberately misinterpreted to cause division. Police officers have always dealt with people based on how they need to be dealt with as opposed to the way they look. And I think even in this case, it was basically based on what turned out to be inaccurate, false, misleading information that was initially given, that when the officers turned up, because of how the events then unfolded, they didn't have the time to slow things down, to pause first, to look at the legislation or consider what they were actually dealing with in respect to the offences alleged, and then prioritise the individuals there, as in you've got a victim of an assault, an actual victim of assault, who's clearly struggling to breathe. That's the priority, which ended up being the priority as opposed to when they first turned up. allegation of racial assault, we must deal with the racial assault first because that's clearly our priority. Because within policing, racially aggravated offences have been given, rightly so in many cases, a significant priority. So seems their mindset. You also have to consider as well that the majority of the front line who are now responding to these calls across the whole of UK police forces have less than 5 years policing experience. You learn a lot in policing, but actually your experience counts a huge amount based on the number of calls you go to, what you're told, how often I mean, this is being blunt, how often you are lied to by people who actually call the police first. When you turn up, they tell you what they told the call handler. And then when you look at what's around them, you can quickly work out for yourself, this isn't quite what we've been told. We are now here at something completely different. But that comes with experience. I think if there'd been more experienced officers who actually attended at the same time, I'm not decrying the officers' experience who turned up, but I think if you learn an awful lot in policing by the number of calls you go to, and the majority of the front line currently across the whole of UK policing has got minimal street experience. They are gaining more as they go, but this was highlighted years ago when you started letting huge swathes of experienced officers leave the front line. Then you were replacing them. And we've heard so many politicians and parties say, I'm going to recruit 20,000 new police officers. Well, those 20,000 new will take 5 to 10 years to get up to what I would term up to speed and relevant street experience to police effectively. I comfortably took 5 to 10 years before I considered myself suitably experienced enough to turn up at any call without asking either a sergeant or a more experienced officer, do you think I'm doing the right thing here? So I think we've almost like created different political parties have created this issue within policing of having a relatively inexperienced frontline service that is now responding to calls from the public. I think it has to go further now. I think this has now almost become such a big case within society, within the public, within the media, even gone away from the UK shores. There's people across the globe talking about this case. I think it goes beyond just the initial officers that turned up. I think they have to give an account of what they did, why they did it, based on what they knew at the time, not just based on the body-worn video that many of us have seen, not just based on the transcript that we are now reading, and 8 minutes seems an awfully long time, but as I've said, 8 minutes to save someone's life in reality isn't, because you are focused on that aspect of it, not on then doing a visual examination of how many injuries they've got, where the injuries are they bleeding. The bleeding aspect has to take for me, second place. 2, I need to keep this person breathing. This person needs to breathe to stay alive. Then I can start, looking at injuries, stab wounds, etc., bleeding, etc. So the priorities has to be balanced. If the bleeding becomes more of an issue than the breathing, then clearly you move over. But that comes with being there at the time and seeing what the priority is. But I think it goes beyond just the initial officers at the scene. They clearly, I think, have to give an account of what they did, why they did it. If only for the family's sake. I think the family deserve to know, legislative-wise and in respect of offences being alleged, there's reasons why people are arrested and cautioned. It's awful that possibly some of the last things he heard, was the fact that he was being arrested and cautioned. He then would have heard, I think, the officers trying to keep him alive and get to breathe. But I think it's an awful thing for him, and that's one of the last things he probably heard was the fact he was being arrested and cautioned. That then, I think, looking at the transcript, that changed as they realised they had somebody who was gravely in front of them and they were trying to keep him alive. The trial judge, who's heard all the evidence, recognised that actually officers did all they could, and there was the pathologist, trained pathologist, as opposed to journalists, reporters and other people, has actually said there was nothing that could be done that would have saved him because of the nature and extent of the internal injuries, not the external injuries, the internal injuries that he'd sustained. So there was nothing they could do anyway. But I think it then goes beyond the initial response, the initial call handling, the initial decisions as to maybe police management, police training, the priorities given to officers when they turn up at incidents like this in respect of a racially aggravated assault's been alleged. Your priority is this aspect or that aspect. I think it goes beyond that. I think the force involved, Hampshire, has some explanations, justification around the communication, what was put out before the trial. And I get the fact that they are limited in what they can say, so it doesn't prejudice the trial, and no one will want that. But I think it needs to be sometimes police communications can improve and should improve, because you now get social media and we've seen, not just in this case, but in other cases, where sometimes people post stuff online, it then becomes, in inverted commas, the truth that other people believe, as opposed to what actually happened and what's been factually proved in the court of law. People ignore that. There are people now disputing what was said in the trial, as in evidence given under testimony, under oath. That can't have happened. That didn't happen because I've read something on the internet. And I think police forces across the country need to have a long look at their communications. We've seen it in other cases where information has been posted online that is factually incorrect, misleading, and deliberately so because it's intended to create division, not just between societies, but between police and the public.